All right, let's dive into this one. 1415. Imagine a young king, barely 2 years on the throne, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to conquer France.
It's a bold move.
To say the least. This is Henry V we're talking about, and it's not just ambition driving him. We've got divine right mixed in there, political maneuvering. I mean, France was basically teetering on the edge.
Yeah, a very unstable situation over there.
And that's what we're going to unpack today. Why Henry decided to roll the dice on this monumental gamble. We're going to wade into the tangled world of French politics, the whole Hundred Years' War thing, and really try to get inside Henry's head, figure out what made him tick.
And what's so interesting about Henry V is this genuine belief that God had chosen him to be king of France. It wasn't just for the optics. This conviction was at the core of his strategy. It shaped every single decision he made.
So it sounds like France was ripe for the taking then. What was the situation across the channel that made Henry think, yeah, I can do this, I can conquer this?
France was, well, imagine powder keg, just waiting for a spark. Their king, Charles VI, was more preoccupied with his delusions than actually ruling the country. Left a huge power vacuum.
Always going to have a power vacuum.
And into that vacuum, two powerful factions emerged, each one fighting for control. You had the Duke of Orleans, known for his extravagant lifestyle, always holding a grudge. And then there was John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, a truly ruthless character. Controlled vast territories and wasn't shy about using force.
Feels like a real-life Game of Thrones almost.
Oh, absolutely. And caught right in the middle of all of this is the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. Still young, really just a pawn in this dangerous game, kidnapped back and forth by these warring factions.
I can't even imagine. A
Yeah.
teenager essentially at the mercy of these power-hungry rivals. No wonder France was in such turmoil.
And to make things even more chaotic, you had this terrifying force in Paris. They were called the Cabotia, paramilitary groups. They wore these distinctive white hoods. They terrorized the city, imposed their will on anyone, nobles, even the king himself.
White hoods terrorizing the city. That image is both, I don't know, fascinating and terrifying all at the same time. Speaks volumes about the state of France back then.
Huh.
So how did England, specifically Henry's father, Henry IV, fit into all this?
Well, Henry IV, he was a shrewd one. Saw the opportunity in all this French chaos, and he played both sides of the conflict to England's advantage. Secured promises of land, wealth, positioned England to benefit from all the turmoil across the channel.
So he was setting the stage for Henry V's ambitions.
Exactly. When Henry V inherited the throne, he also inherited this volatile situation and saw a chance to, seize what his father had so cleverly positioned England to gain.
Makes sense. And don't forget, Henry V, young, battle-hardened from Wales, and of course that deep conviction in his divine right to rule France.
Yeah, that's a potent combination for sure. Youth, military experience, unwavering belief in his God-given destiny. It almost seems inevitable he'd set his sights on France, doesn't it?
It really does. But was he just a religious zealot? I mean, you have to think there was more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely. Henry V, brilliant strategist. He knew a successful war would solidify his claim to the English throne. Let's not forget, his father was a usurper. And it would unite the people, give them a common enemy to rally against.
So personal and political motivations all rolled into one, not just some blind crusade fueled by religious fervor.
Exactly. There was calculation behind his actions. He wasn't just a warrior king. He was a sharp political player.
Okay, so we've got France in disarray, ripe for the taking. But launching an invasion, I mean, that takes resources. Manpower, logistics, a lot of things.
It does indeed, and this is where we really see Henry V's planning, his strategic brilliance. He had a formidable team. Loyal brothers, experienced commanders like the Earl of Arundel, whose herald, as you might know, was the historian Anne Curry, even figures like Dick Whittington lending their support.
And we can't forget the English longbow. That thing dominated medieval battlefields.
Exactly. Henry V had seen its power firsthand. He assembled a huge force of archers, giving him an advantage few armies in Europe could match. But it wasn't just about brute force. Henry was incredibly thorough. Parliament had granted him funds, ensuring he had the resources for a prolonged campaign. He even commissioned the biggest cannon ever built in England, a sign he was committed to using the most advanced military tech available.
Combining the best of English military tradition with cutting-edge weaponry.
Exactly. He was leaving nothing to chance in his quest to conquer France.
All right, so we've got our young king, backing of Parliament, a powerful army, and this unwavering belief he's destined to rule France. What finally pushed him over the edge to launch the invasion? Were there any attempts at diplomacy?
There were attempts, but ultimately they didn't achieve what Henry wanted. This is where we get that famous story about the tennis balls sent by the Dauphin. Highlights the arrogance of the French court, and Henry's absolute determination.
Had to ask about that. Always wondered if that was truly a historical event or just, I don't know, a dramatic embellishment added later.
Hard to say for sure. The tennis balls themselves might be a fabrication, but there's evidence that the French court mocked Henry's demands and basically told him to stay out of their affairs.
So they make one last-ditch effort at diplomacy, offering Henry terms. But he refuses. It seems like he was in a good spot to negotiate at that point. Why not?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. For Henry, this wasn't about land or political power. He truly believed God had chosen him to rule France. Backing down would be like betraying that divine mandate.
So a moral obligation to pursue this conquest, you could say.
You could. And don't forget the political side. Henry's legitimacy as King of England was still a bit shaky, considering his father. A decisive victory in France, well, that would solidify his claim to the throne, unite the English people, give him the authority he needed to really rule.
High-stakes game, then. Failure in France could have been disastrous back home.
Absolutely. Invading France, it was a calculated risk, but a gamble nonetheless.
And then just to add to the drama, a conspiracy pops up right before he sets sail.
Oh yeah, can't forget that. One of his own cousins was plotting to overthrow him. An act of treason that Henry dealt with decisively. Underscores how precarious his position was, the weight on his shoulders.
Treason, instability at home, the uncertainty of war. It's amazing he still went through with it.
It speaks volumes about his belief, his destiny, his willingness to risk it all for what he believed was his God-given right. And the situation in France wasn't getting any better. John the Fearless had formed this terrifying force in Paris, the Cabotia. They wore white hoods and really terrorized the city. Their actions reflected just how deep the societal divisions and anxieties were at the time.
I can't imagine the fear in Paris. It must have felt like the world was ending.
It was a time of incredible uncertainty and danger, that's for sure.
So August 1415, Henry finally sets sail. Paint us a picture. What was that like?
It was a sight to behold, that's for sure. Imagine a fleet of 1,500 ships, an armada that made even the Spanish Armada look small, setting off from Southampton, just the sheer scale of it, a testament to Henry's ambition, his determination.
That's a mind-boggling number of ships.
It was a massive undertaking, no doubt about it. And for added suspense, they kept the destination secret. The English fleet landed near Harfleur, catching the French completely off guard.
What a move. So we have our young king, convinced of his divine purpose, leading this massive, well-equipped army. He's landed on enemy soil, facing a divided nation. He's ready to risk it all. What happens next? I'm on the edge of my seat.
Harfleur, well, it was heavily fortified, a major port city. Henry was determined to take it. Laid siege to the city, bombarded it with his massive cannon. He wanted a decisive victory, a quick one to really set the tone for his campaign.
But sieges, especially back then, they were brutal. Didn't they usually drag on for months, sometimes even years?
They did, and that's exactly what happened at Harfleur. The siege became this grueling affair, dragged on for over a month. The English faced fierce resistance, and then to make matters worse, disease started spreading through the ranks.
Disease in an army camp.
Yeah.
Not a good combination. What was it exactly that was plaguing Henry's forces?
Dysentery was running rampant, ravaged the English army, weakened the soldiers, slowed their progress significantly, forced Henry to change his plans. Really highlights the logistical challenges of warfare back then. Something as simple as bad water could derail even the best laid plans.
So Harfleur, a costly victory, if you can even call it that. Did they even manage to take the city?
Eventually, yes. After a month of constant bombardment and fighting, Harfleur surrendered. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The English army was depleted, demoralized, and certainly not in any shape for a long campaign.
Not the start Henry was hoping for then. What did this mean for his grand plan to conquer Normandy?
It was a major setback, no question. The siege had eaten up precious time and resources, winter was approaching, and the English army was in no condition to face a French counterattack.
So what were Henry's options at this point? He couldn't just pack up and go home after such a hard-fought siege, could he?
He could have, but retreating would have been seen as a humiliating defeat. And remember, Henry wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting to legitimize his rule, to prove his divine right. Turning back would have undermined everything he was trying to achieve.
So he needed a bold move, something to salvage the situation. What did he do?
He made a decision that would define his legacy. He decided to march his battered army across northern France to Calais, a port city still held by the English, 100 miles through hostile territory, with a weakened army and winter coming. It It was a risky move, to say the least.
Sounds incredibly dangerous. Was he marching into a trap?
It was a gamble, for sure. The French army, much larger and fresher than the English, was shadowing their movements, waiting to strike. And this is where we get to the legendary Battle of Agincourt.
Agincourt, one of the most famous battles in English history. But before we get into that, why didn't Henry just sail back to Calais? Why risk the march?
Sailing might seem like the obvious choice, but there were a few things to consider. The English ships had been scattered after Harfleur. Gathering them would have taken time Henry didn't have with the French on his heels.
And I doubt the English would have been welcomed in French-controlled ports.
Exactly. And then there's the English Channel in the fall. Storms could be fierce and unpredictable. Sailing then would have been incredibly risky. Marching, while dangerous, gave Henry more control.
Okay, so march he did. Set the scene for us. What led to the clash at Agincourt?
The French army, confident in their numbers and position, caught up with the English near this village, Agincourt. The English were outnumbered, exhausted, their morale was low. They were trapped between the French army and a dense forest, their backs against this muddy field.
Talk about a desperate situation. What were the odds? I can't imagine they were in Henry's favor.
They were severely outnumbered. Historians estimate the French had maybe 20 to 30,000 men, the English forces, perhaps 6 to 9,000.
That's a huge difference. Was this a David versus Goliath scenario?
In many ways, yes. The French, with their heavily armored knights, they were used to dominating battlefields. They saw the English, who relied heavily on archers, as inferior. They expected a quick, decisive victory.
So how did this seemingly impossible battle unfold? Did the French just charge in and crush the English?
Not quite. This is where the terrain and Henry's strategic thinking come into play. The battlefield, it was this muddy field, narrowed by the woods on either side. This terrain, which seemed like a disadvantage, would actually work in the English favor.
How so? Wouldn't the mud have slowed everyone down?
It did, but the heavy armor the French knights wore, it became a liability in that thick mud. They got bogged down, became easy targets for the English archers.
So the terrain that seemed like a disadvantage, it became a weapon for the English.
Precisely. And Henry used it to his advantage. He positioned his archers on the flanks where they had a clear line of fire across the battlefield.
I'm picturing it now. A muddy field, the French knights struggling to advance, and then what?
The French, impatient and overconfident, they charged across the field, hoping to break the English lines quickly. This was exactly what Henry was hoping for.
He led them into a trap.
He did. The English archers unleashed a devastating barrage of arrows. Thousands of them rained down on the advancing French, creating chaos. The impact was devastating.
A hail of arrows, decimating the French. Must have been a terrifying sight.
It was a brutal scene. The French knights, weighed down by their armor and the mud, were slaughtered before they could even reach the English lines. Those who did manage to break through were met by a wall of English men-at-arms.
So the French strategy completely backfired.
It did. Their reliance on heavy armor, usually a strength, it became their downfall in the mud. And their overconfidence, well, that led them right into Henry's trap.
It's incredible to think that the English, despite being outnumbered, were able to achieve such a stunning victory.
The Battle of Agincourt, it became one of the most remarkable victories in English military history. The French losses were catastrophic. Thousands killed, including many of their top noblemen. The English, while they had casualties too, they had achieved the impossible.
So Agincourt, a decisive victory for Henry. What happened next? Did this clear the path for him to march on to Calais and back to England? A conquering hero.
It did. The French were demoralized, the path to Calais was open, and Henry returned to England a hero, no doubt about it.
So this wasn't just a raid then. This was a turning point.
It was a major victory with consequences that would be felt for a long time.
But what about political gains? Did this give Henry the recognition, the power he craved?
He was definitely in a much stronger position. Agincourt solidified his hold on the English throne, silenced any doubters, increased his prestige across Europe. He wasn't that underestimated young king anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with.
So what did he do with his newfound power? Did he go straight for the French throne?
He was strategic. He knew that true power wasn't just about battles. It was about securing a lasting peace. But on his terms, Agincourt had set a new stage for the 100 Years' War.
So not quite game over then. Still a long way to go.
It was a stepping stone, not the final destination.
What happened next in this campaign to conquer France?
1417, Henry goes back to France, but with a clear strategy this time. Conquer Normandy. Systematically, this wasn't about raids or a single battle anymore. It was about taking and holding territory.
That's a whole different level of commitment. What kind of challenges did he face in this new phase of the war?
It was grueling, conquering Normandy, heavily fortified cities, resistance from the locals, even outbreaks of plague continued to plague his army. It wasn't a glorious conquest, more a war of attrition. It demanded patience, resources, strategic thinking.
Yeah, I can only imagine the logistics of all those sieges. Did Henry adapt his tactics, his strategies for this kind of warfare?
He did. He refined his use of artillery. Cannons were crucial for breaking down those city defenses. He also used some more, shall we say, unconventional tactics. Mining, digging tunnels under the walls to weaken them.
Brutal, but effective. It's a reminder that medieval warfare wasn't just knights on horseback. A lot of engineering involved, brutality too. Any sieges stand out during this Norman campaign?
The Siege of Rouen, that was a big one. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, a key strategic city. Taking it was a major objective for Henry. It was a long and brutal siege, almost a year. In the end, the city was starved into submission, a grim reality of medieval warfare.
A year-long siege. Hard to grasp the suffering on both sides. How did the French as a nation respond to this? Were they just falling apart?
While Henry was gaining ground in Normandy, France, well, they were still deeply divided. The Civil War, Armagnacs versus Burgundians, raged on, weakened their ability to put up a united front against the English, played right into Henry's hands.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Classic. Did this lead to any big political shifts within France?
It did. 1419, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, he's assassinated by agents of the Dauphin. And this had huge consequences for both the French and Henry's ambitions.
A major turning point, it seems. Why was this assassination so significant?
Changed everything, politically speaking. The Burgundians, they were outraged naturally. They allied themselves with Henry V. This alliance, well, it was a decisive turning point in the war.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Amazing how one event, like an assassination, can have such a huge impact on history. What happened next?
Treaty of Troy, 1420. A monumental victory for Henry. He's officially recognized as heir to the French throne, the Dauphin, disinherited. Henry also marries Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king.
Wow, so through battles, alliances, and a bit of luck, he pulled it off. Achieved what seemed impossible just a few years earlier.
A remarkable ascent, no question. From a young king, his own claim shaky, to heir to the French throne, about to rule both kingdoms.
A Shakespearean drama, if I ever heard one. So did he just waltz into Paris, claim his crown?
Not so fast. The Treaty of Troy, a huge victory, but it didn't end the war. The Dauphin, he had nothing left to lose. He continued to resist. From his base in the south, France, it was still divided. Pockets of resistance remained.
So even with the treaty, Henry's grasp on power wasn't absolute. Still challenges ahead. What happened next?
1421, Henry and Catherine have a son. Henry VI seemed to cement Henry's position, continued his lineage on both thrones.
Everything was coming up Henry. Did he finally get to enjoy it? Rule his vast dual kingdom?
Tragically, no. 1422, while he's on campaign in France, Henry V dies. Suddenly. He was only 35.
What a turn of events. Triumph, legacy secured, then it's all cut short. What happened? How did he die?
Still debated, the exact cause. But most likely dysentery, the same disease that had ravaged his army years earlier. A cruel irony. A king who conquered kingdoms brought down by a common illness.
A reminder that even the most powerful are not immune to fate. Henry V, story of ambition, military genius, political maneuvering, and in the end, tragedy.
A lot accomplished in a short time. Makes you wonder what might have been if he'd lived longer.
A question to ponder, for sure. Henry V, a king of contradictions, driven by divine right, a shrewd political mind, a legacy of triumph and tragedy. That's our deep dive into the story of Henry V and his invasion of France. Until next time.